Today I am joined by Professor Tai Yong. He is the Dean of the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Professor Tan has the book, The Idea of Singapore, Smallness and Constraint. I'll be doing a giveaway of this book. So if you would like to win this book, just sign up at www.ykeith.com and I'll notify the winner by a deadline in the description below. I hope you will enjoy this conversation about Singapore's rich 700-year history as much as I did. Dean, the first question I had for you was that how did Lee Kuan Yew and the founding fathers treat the idea of history in forming Singapore?
So the ruling party, the PAP, had a very interesting take on Singapore's history. So unlike many post-colonial governments, they did not at first jettison colonialism. If you look at a lot of post-colonial states, the first thing they do after independence is to get rid of all remnants of colonialism or imperialism. They change their road names, they change the names of their buildings, their founding fathers and all this to embrace the new nation. In Singapore's case, what happened was that they did keep Raffles, the legacy of British colonialism, as a way of indicating that Singapore was not going to turn down a road that is going to take it away from businesses and trade, that it will continue to trade with the West, notwithstanding its colonial past. So that is the reason why statue of Raffles remained on the edge of Singapore River and it was not thrown into the river, unlike many post-colonial countries that would want to sort of get rid of all reminders of colonialism. So that was the first interesting thing about Singapore post-1965. The second is that it is also a very progressive country that was always looking forward. So development, economic growth, social stability, all these were important priorities for the government of the day. It did not want to have the luxury of sort of thinking too much about history, looking backwards and looking at the past, because Singapore was an immigrant society, a port city. It did not have a civilizational past. So there was no need for Singapore to look back and say, hey, we had a golden age. And then this determines our identity. The identity was being built post-65. So there was a forward-looking kind of agenda as opposed to a backward-looking kind of thing where history was important. So history, although was preserved in some form, in the form of wanting to continue engaging the West, was jettisoned for growth and development. So 60s, 70s, there was little emphasis on history. It was on economic growth, technical development, infrastructure development. It was only in the 1980s or late 80s when the government realized that a new generation of Singaporeans were growing up not knowing the history and they were getting complacent, they were taking things for granted, that there was beginning to talk about the importance of having some historical knowledge, of knowing how Singapore came about. But the emphasis was on how Singapore was part of Malaysia, exited Malaysia under rather unhappy circumstances and had to build a nation on its own. So that was the take of the first generation of leaders on Singapore's history.
And they kind of saw 1819, when Stamford Raffles found Singapore, as the point where modern Singapore was born. Why did they do that? And looking back, is that actually the wrong starting point?
I think it's the wrong starting point as a historian because, when you start your history at 1819, it is to suggest that nothing that happened before that mattered, or there was no history before that. Singapore was just this black hole, which is not true, as we now know. So 1819 was taken as the starting point by, I guess, the leaders of Singapore at the time, simply to mark that was the point where Singapore embarked on the journey to become a modern state. Before that, it was part of the Malay world and it was medieval and it was classical, but it was only from 1819 when Singapore became part of the East India Company that it built port infrastructures, got linked to the world trade and became a modern city-state. That was the start of the journey. Some of the leaders, however, felt that actually 1819 was a good starting point because as a new country, as a country that was made up mainly of immigrant population, it's important to build a new identity that is not based on sort of old allegiances to different parts of the world, you see. So if you had a history that it goes back, say, centuries before the 19th century, And the thing is that people will start identifying with primeval kind of identity. So whether you were Chinese from China, Indians from India, Malays from the archipelago. So that made it more difficult for people to build a new Singaporean identity. So that was part of the thinking as well, that it is best if we want to build a new multiracial community to have a clean start. And starting with the British, which were in a way, outsiders to the region, and introduce modernity through language, the legal system, trade, that would be a good start to build a new identity, a new nation. So don't go back too far, because then people will start identifying with different origins, and that could make it difficult to build a new community. So that was the thinking. So 1819 was a very convenient start. The British in a way were neutral because they were not from the region, so you didn't have the old tensions of regional rivalries clouding or complicating the process of nation building. There was a period of colonialism, and then after that independence from colonialism, and then you had a new start. And the new start was the new nation. And then you said, okay, we had a past that could be traced back to 1819, and then the story took us to 1965, and a new nation was born. And then you draw some of the lessons from colonialism, like immigration, trade, openness, but at the same time, some of the deprivations of colonialism as well, inequality, unequal treatment. And then on that kind of narrative, you build that, okay, now we are on our own, we are sovereign, and we can build a new nation going forward. So going too far back complicates matters, because then you have many layers of history which you are not ready to unpack. And that's why it was decided that maybe 1819 was a very convenient starting point.
What was the downside of them doing that, in a sense of trying to move away from history as fast as possible? Like you talked about the fact that they were quite progressive, they wanted to move forward. So in a certain sense, it's not that they erased history, but they kind of de-emphasized that. What was the downsides for Singapore as a nation state?
Identity is built on the basis of your memories, your heritage, of who you are. So when you start at a particular point that is not so deep, then people will start asking questions. What is my true heritage? It cannot be. We started from the fact that my grandfather migrated to Singapore and started life here as a coolie, and then built his future here. So I think that was kind of artificial in a sense. So the deeper heritage, where what are our roots, our cultural roots, all these things were not clear. But as I said earlier, I think the ruling government of the day really felt that there was no time for such luxury. We should look forward and forget the past as much as we can, and basically build a new future. But after a while, I think you have to ask yourselves, did Singapore start in 1965 or was it 59? So I think these are the questions that people started asking. And when questions were asked, I think people needed to dig deeper. And historians then started looking at our past and say, did we only begin our history when the British arrived? What happened before that? And clearly, there's the Malay world, there are Southeast Asian heritages that we inherited. What happened to those things? So I think that was the cost when you did not have that deep stretch back into history to understand where we came from.
And part of it, I think, probably when you don't dig deep into the past, I think part of it is that you kind of take what you have for granted as well, because then you are unable to appreciate the time scale in which Singapore has evolved from. So then my follow-up question would be, if we were to look back at the history of Singapore pre-1819, what would it be like? I know there's 700 years. So what would the 700 years of Singapore history actually look like?
So if you stretch the Singapore history back another, say, 7-8 centuries, then you see that actually there are very interesting cycles of history, where Singapore was at one time what we call autonomous. It had an identity of its own, a status of its own. At some other part, it was part of an empire or sultanate. And that this long history suggests that Singapore has its ebbs and flows, in terms of its destiny, in terms of its fate and fortunes. So then the story becomes much more complicated. And if you draw back all the way to, say, the 14th century, and then you see that actually for the long part of Singapore history, we were always part of something else. And then if you then juxtapose it to the period after 65, It's only the last 60 years that we were an independent sovereign state. No? For the best part of our long history, we were something else, you see. And that really gives us a different sense of perspective about who we are as Singaporeans. So when I give lectures on Singapore, I always try to work backwards from 1965. I say, you look at it, from now, 65 to 60 years, we were nation state. Before 65 to 63, we were part of Malaysia, right? 63, before 63, we were colony, a crown colony. Then we were for 2 years plus part of the Japanese Empire. And before that, of course, colony and then East India Company. Going further back, Johor Sultanate, Malacca Sultanate, Majapahit, Srivijaya. So we were always part of something else. Being an independent state is actually only in this latest phase of our history, last 60 years. So that gives us a different perspective and understanding of the long stretch of Singapore's evolution. And I think that is interesting in itself.
Yeah, so if I could dive deeper into that, I wanted to understand what were the civilizational influences that India, perhaps India where your field of expertise lies in, had on Singapore in the pre-1819 eras. Because we understand in Chinese civilization and its relation to Southeast Asia was primarily focused on trade. So there was a lot of economic influence in the way maybe the sultanates treated China. But what about India? How did India influence the development or evolution of Singapore?
Singapore per se was probably not as deep, but India's influence, civilizational influence as you call it, on Southeast Asia was quite profound. You think of religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, it spread from India to parts of Southeast Asia and influenced culture, literature, architecture of major parts of Southeast Asia. Look at Borobudur, look at Angkor Wat. All these were influenced by Indian religions. Buddhism became very prominent in places like Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. And then, of course, languages, Sanskrit and literature. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata, I think, continues to be sort of performed in different parts of Indonesia, although it's kind of adapted to more Southeast Asian flavors. In terms of Singapore, basically it was the trading of the place, and the regional dynamics when the Cholas came down to trade and sometimes invaded, Majapahit rose and fell, Srivijaya as well. It had an impact on Singapore. Now think of the political systems as well. The Indian Mandala system, where you had decentralized kingdoms, the head of the Raja or Maharaja. I think this was the system that operated in Southeast Asia during that time. And Singapore had a place in that kind of dynamics. If you think of our history, Temasek, it was a prince who, in a way, came from Palembang, set up a place and renamed it Singapura. And then after that, there was the movements of people to Malacca. The kings ran away to Malacca because, again, of regional dynamics and fights and invasions. And then the Malacca Sultanate rose and Singapore faded. So all these were, in a way, generated by the kinds of politics that happened during that time. And the politics, culture, society, religion, all had deep influences from India. So in a way, Singapore was indirectly influenced, but Indian influence on Southeast Asia was quite deep and profound.
What would then be the continuity if you look across maybe the 700-year horizon from maybe if we look back at the 13th century where we start to see some influence of trade in this area in Singapore all the way till today, right? There are some continuities that are, I won't say dictated by the forces of history, but maybe by geography, by economics. So what are some of the continuities you see as a historian?
So the continuities, I'll say, in terms of Singapore's role in the dynamics of the region, one is in trade. So it has always played the role of a kind of a port polity, whether it's a small town, a small city, or even just a port infrastructure. It has always, because of its location, supported trade dynamics of the region. So from Southeast Asia to China, the Ming sort of trade, to the Middle East sometimes, and to, of course, northern part of Southeast Asia, Thailand and so on. So Singapore has always, in a way, been in a strategic location that has served the trading routes of the region. So that's one continuity. I think the second continuity is that, because it is able to adapt to different political configurations, whether it's empire, Sriwijaya, then later Majapahit, or whether it is part of the Malacca or Johor Sultanate, it's always been able to adapt to shifting circumstances, making itself relevant. And when it's no longer relevant, Singapore fades into obscurity. But when it's relevant, it becomes important. So one example is when it served as the Shah Bandar of Johor Sultanate, it was able to become useful to not only Johor's trade with the region and with China, but the European trade that was already developing at the time, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then later Dutch East Indies. So this was where Singapore had that role to play because of its location and because of its ability to serve different kind of trading configurations. So this was the continuity. So from the 14th century, you see that at different times, it has always played that role. And today, even as a global city-state, you can say that the essence remains as a port city.
We've seen, I think as you pointed out, across time, port cities may gain relevance and then lose its relevance, right? So what are the characteristics of a port city that makes it useful?
Yeah. So connectivity is one thing. If you are not in a good location and you are in some out-of-the-way kind of location, you will not succeed. So I think that's the first thing. The location is important. So where we are located, Straits of Malacca, for centuries, it has always remained an important trade route, and even now, the shipping that flows through the Straits of Malacca is one of the busiest in the world, and Singapore, in a way, is fortunate to be located where it is. Second is basically you are in a world where a lot of trading happens and you can plug yourself into those kinds, as a node, into those kinds of trading routes. So, Singapore was so-called founded by Raffles because he was looking for a foothold to connect India and China by trade. And where it was located, it was almost perfect. You sail down and then the Straits of Malacca, then on to China and vice versa. And monsoon winds at that time, blew in the right directions at different times of the year, facilitating trade. So the connectivity, I would say, would be key. But at the same time, I think you have to stay relevant because there could be different port cities because you don't have monopoly of location. There could be other ports that come up and then they challenge you. So innovation and being able to ride, I guess, the challenges of the time is important. So when steamship came into play, Singapore became a coaling station. So that in a way facilitated the sailing of steamships and all that. And then after independence, Singapore built port facilities and all that because there were competitions from elsewhere, from India, from China. So I think innovation and the continuing attempt to make oneself relevant and connected to those trade routes are important considerations as well. You see instances of port cities that were prominent at one stage. Malacca is a good example. Penang being less prominent today. And that's because of combination of factors, political as well as geographical and technology and innovation.
Singapore did also lose its relevance in the past. I think when you talk about the Shah Bandar, and maybe later you can elaborate as to what its specific function was and what a Shah Bandar is for listeners who might not know. But Singapore did lose its relevance. And in those cases, what were the factors that kind of made it not retain its vital function as a node in that kind of global world pre-1819?
Yeah. Political shifts were important, and here one can think of current geopolitics. So in the 19th century, you can see that there were political shifts happening around the region. So trade in one area between Johor, Aceh and the Riau, and then you have the Bugis and the Minangkabaus, and then you have the European trades. They all were trying to sort of carve up different parts of Southeast Asia for themselves. So if you happen to be in an area that is thriving and growing, then I guess you get carried by the momentum. But Singapore happened to be in a part from at the turn of the 19th century where the influence of the political powers of the time, the Malay world of the Johor Sultanate, was fading in connection with the rise of the Bugis power and also the Europeans trading in the area. So when you are caught in that kind of scenario, then you fade. So I think that was the situation that Singapore was in just before Raffles arrived and then signed the treaty with the Temenggong. The Shah Bandar is actually a place at the tip of the Johor Sultanate where it served as a very convenient location for goods to be gathered and distributed and exported out, a collection point if you want. But it was also a kind of a point where the Johor Sultanate could interact with the rest of the world without going inland, you see. So again, its location where it is served that particular purpose. So Singapore was a good intermediate point, if you want, between the inland and the waters around it. So that was the purpose that Singapore served as part of the Shah Bandar. But I think what happened was that trade, the prominence of the trade then started to fade as the Europeans came into the picture and the Bugis and the Minangkabau started moving into the peninsula and dominating the trade there. So the trade on the Aceh, Riau, Johor side started to fade a little. So that, in a way, was the change in the power configuration. So when you have major shifts like that, it affects players in the region. So if you want to sort of have a present-day parallel, is when geopolitics shift, supply chains are disrupted, and then it will affect the players on that kind of situation.
It also explains why, for example, the Singapore government is so proactive on the international stage for such a small state. Because what you're trying to do is constantly trying to retain relevance in a time of changing geopolitics or a change in the global world order. Another theme that I've picked out in your work is that Singapore is not just a global city today. There's this hint of globalism stretching all the way 700 years back. You said that Rajaratnam had this aspiration of Singapore to be a global city, and in part, he thought that we were reinventing something new. But if we look back at history, Singapore was indeed global. In what sense was it global?
Well, if you think about it, Singapore, before the arrival of the British, served as a kind of a node, a hub, a port city, or whatever it is. And it was not really localized. It did not only serve the hinterland, a land-based hinterland. I had argued that actually Singapore's hinterland was maritime. In other words, the hinterland was a space that its sailing crafts could reach or could be reached from different parts of Southeast Asia, and that was the space in which it operated. People think of Malaya as Singapore's natural hinterland, but the Malayan hinterland was only open in the second half of the 19th century when the British moved north and discovered tin and rubber. And then Singapore became the staple port of the hinterland. But before that, it was the entire Southeast Asian region, from the Celebes, to Sumatra and beyond. And then the Chinese, of course, sailed to these parts as well. So that was the space in which Singapore operated. Then after 1819, it became part of the imperial order, right? It became part of the British Empire. So when Singapore got developed into a port city, it was able to serve the trade all the way from the Middle East and Europe, all the way to China and Japan. So basically that was a kind of a global trade network, and Singapore was part of it. So there was already some form of global presence, even before Rajaratnam spoke about globalization. But of course, he meant it in a very different way after 1971, talking about connectivity, technology, being part of a network of global cities. But globalization was not new to Singapore. That was my point, you see, that actually before 1819, after 1819, it was already operating on that kind of scale. You can call it regional or you can call it global, but the point it was not isolated or it was not localized.
Yeah. And in a sense, when I read his speech, I think it would be an acceleration of what was happening before. So it's not necessarily just by maritime, but now you're looking at flight.
Yeah.
You're looking at data, right? So I think the number of ways in which Singapore can connect to the world, I think just exponentially increased over time.
Yeah, exactly. And he had another purpose. He was saying that, Singapore cannot continue to depend only on Southeast Asia. If you know the history of the period, 1965 to 1970s, I mean, Southeast Asia was quite a troubled region, right? There was the onset of the Cold War. Singapore left Malaysia under rather unhappy circumstances. There was confrontasi and all that sort of thing. So he was saying that if Singapore continued to sort of place its bets on Southeast Asia, it's going to be limiting its growth and potential. So Singapore must be ambitious. It must look to the world as its hinterland. And that's why globalization, being a global city, was important for Singapore. It had to leapfrog the region so that it cannot try to continue to serve its traditional role as an entrepot to Southeast Asia. That kind of businesses is dying, and it will not serve Singapore well. So Singapore must be ambitious, connect to the rest of the world, do business with the rest of the world, leverage on technology, air travel, and what have you. But the important thing is that it must now make the world its hinterland. And that was the vision that Rajaratnam was articulating in the early 1970s.
And there was this idea of globalism in the sense that Singapore did interact with the rest of the world via trade and maybe via cultural diffusion. In maybe the earlier years, in your pre-independence years, did that actually shape social reality in the sense of how people saw themselves, how people saw each other, or was Singapore just a transient place? And it was just where we meet, but we go on and do our separate things.
Singapore was a colony, right? So the people who benefited most were the British merchants, the British elite, so to speak, because they could reap the benefits of globalism or globalization through trade, through businesses, that sort of thing. But if you were a working person in Singapore, I mean, it was basically just getting on with life, and you worked either as a person who was building some infrastructure or just serving in a municipal services or working on transportation. It was a place of work. So I think people did not have that kind of vision at that time. You came to Singapore to look for work, to make a living, and then I think your loyalties could be somewhere else. So in a sense, people were not thinking in terms of globalism or globalization or how it would benefit them. It was a place of just economic opportunities. Some simply manual work, some found opportunities to do trade and flourish, and others were just sort of caught in a kind of a situation where they were being exploited by, the people who wanted to just make money and make wealth.
And in a certain sense, the greatest discontinuity in the past 700 years was what you pointed out earlier, was Singapore becoming an independent nation state. So now Singapore is no longer just a place for economic opportunity. Now you actually need to become a nation. What were the implications of this discontinuity?
So before Singapore gained independence, it was just a port city where you had a lot of immigrant workers, right? And then as Singapore moved towards independence, it had to have a kind of a political identity. And that's where citizenship was introduced, statehood was introduced. But until independence, Singaporeans were still known as British subjects. But there was those who had stayed long enough and did not return to their homeland, sunk roots in Singapore, they had to take on a new identity. And this was where citizenship was introduced. But after 1965, when Singapore left Malaysia and became a sovereign state on its own, then you had to have citizens who owed allegiance to a nation state. So that was now different because you are now a nation state with your own citizens, as opposed to just a kind of a colony where people came to work and were transient. So you now have a settled population who are citizens and who would have a stake in their new home. And this was home. And they would elect governments, and then they would make this, they would basically, Singapore would be the place where they would either make or break their future. So there was no thinking of going back to another place, There There was no other domiciles for them. Singapore was home. And I think that was different. So 65 onwards, Singapore became totally new entity, a nation state. No longer a colony, no longer a kind of a port polity serving regional networks. It was a country.
And as a historian that maybe you've studied and learned how the government shaped the nation in a sense of nation building, because I think the state building capacity was relatively strong in the sense that we inherited systems from the colonial government, but there was no idea of a nation being built. How did the founding generation of leaders approach nation building? And then I think what were the upsides of them going with their elected approach?
When Singapore became independent, the founding leaders were very clear that they had to build a new nation. But this new nation, because of the makeup of the population, had to be multiracial and multi-religious, because we did not have a large indigenous core, you see. If you were Persian, Iran, or you were Chinese, or you were Egyptian, or you were Indian, you had a large indigenous core. Singapore did not have that. And most of the population, the majority were Chinese immigrants, Indians. And of course, you had an indigenous population, the Malays, but they were a minority. So out of this, you had to build a new nation. So you had to give people a new identity, right? So where they no longer identify themselves as coming from the outside, but they were now citizens and this is their home. So this is where you have to build a new nation and create a new identity. How did they do it? I think nation building was a progressive, long-term enterprise. So you had to get people to think of themselves as Singaporeans, have a stake in the country, and have a belief that this is their home. So through series of measures like education, national service, building of homes, and creating opportunities, giving people a sense that there's a hope in this new home. I think by and by you create that kind of identity. But you're building it in a situation where people had differences to begin with, racial differences, religious differences. So how do you meld it together? So I think the approach was, in a way, racialism, multiculturalism, where there is a respect and acceptance that each of you have a different identity, but overlaid with a kind of belief that you are Singaporean. So you have a Chinese, and you have Chinese cultural traits and maybe religious practices, but you are Singaporean at the same time, where you can live together in one society and yet practice different religious and cultural traditions and norms. I think that was the challenge, and I think that's why multiracialism, multiculturalism was such an important part of the nation-building effort.
Were there any downsides to promoting multiracialism as a core tenet of Singaporean identity?
I think it's always, I won't call it a downside, I will call it challenging, right?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have to let different ethnic groups, religious groups, continue to have their own practices, their own belief systems, and then be able to coexist with people from different belief systems, held together by common citizenship and nationality, that is Singaporean. Now, how do you strike that balance is always quite challenging and not easy to achieve. The alternative was assimilation. That means you have a very dominant race, or you have a very dominant belief system, and everybody has to assimilate into that. I think that would have been quite difficult and probably not ideal in that, well, what is that central one? Does everybody need to be Chinese because the Chinese are majority? Does everybody have to forego, in a way, their religious and their racial beliefs just so that we all can have one common identity? I think that would have been a more difficult and negative approach. Whereas integration, as opposed to assimilation, was that you can have your different practices, but we try to hold on together by our belief that we are Singaporeans. I think that was a more positive, progressive approach. Not easy, but I think that was what, in a way, made Singapore, I believe, successful in its approach to multiculturalism, because allowing space for each of us to practice our own heritage, traditions, and belief systems, but at the same time held together by something that transcends that, and that's our citizenship, our loyalty to the country. So there will always be some tensions, but I think by and large, Singapore did it quite well.
you see an increasing trend of interracial marriages show that the multiculturalism aspect works.
Yeah.
Because now people identify themselves first as Singaporeans and then their race. So naturally, when they're maybe marrying someone, then the racial aspect, although with its challenges, is not as salient as if, let's say, you were to put race as a very important criteria.
I think the important thing was nobody was marginalized on account of their race or religion, you see. And meritocracy had a part to play in it because everybody, no matter what race or religion you belong to, had a chance to succeed on the basis of your abilities, you know. So I think all those things put together actually made Singapore work in the first 30 or 40 years of its history. Of course, then when diversity becomes more diverse, then there'll be more challenges. You know, then there are all these nuances. So you mentioned the CMIO. So in each of these categories, there are now diversities. And how do you deal with these diversities? So you mentioned intermarriages as well. It complicates this clear demarcation of race. And meritocracy, whether it continues to work as well as it did 30 or 40 years ago, is now open for debate. So I think society now becomes more complicated, more challenging, and I think this is where I guess governing Singapore becomes more and more complicated.
Another paradox that we face outside of being a multicultural society where you are trying to build a common identity as Singaporeans is that we also are now a city-state. That we're one of the rare city-states in the world. Could you help us unpack? Was there a unique advantage of Singapore being a city-state?
So Singapore has always, it's a small country, a small nation-state. And its success, its future success will always depend on its ability to go beyond the confines of geography and make itself relevant, useful, and connected to the rest of the world. So this was the vision that Rajaratnam articulated in the early 90s, and this was what Singapore has always operated on even before that. So if Singapore, after 65, were to turn inwards and say that we are now a nation state, we will be self-sufficient and we will just do everything within our shores, I think then Singapore has no future because no land, no hinterland, no natural resources, then what are we going to live on? So trade and connections and for international talents are what keeps Singapore going. So I think this has to be the case for Singapore to continue to function as a global city-state, both in actual practices and in its belief that it's got a larger world beyond the island. But after 65, Singapore also became a nation-state, and a nation-state really meant that you have a group of citizens who see Singapore as home, and when they see Singapore as home, they say that then there are boundaries, right? And then we have, the people who are in and the people who are out. And when Singapore needs to remain porous as much as possible, then how do you strike that balance between the people who consider themselves Singaporeans and those whom they consider to be outsiders? And that is where I guess this whole idea of the tension between a nation state and a city-state sometimes will occur. You need to be open, bring in talents, but then citizens will say that, but this comes at my expense sometimes, and I'm not happy with it. But can Singapore afford to close up? I don't think so. But at the same time, you have to make sure that your own citizens don't feel that they have been alienated at the expense of, just keeping Singapore open and bringing as many people in as possible. So that balance has always been a challenge for the government in Singapore.
And that is an eternal tension in the sense that as long as you are a city-state, the degree of openness you have is always something that has to be constantly up for debate. And I think in politics today, we see that all the time. It's just to what extent should Singapore be open? And there isn't a right answer, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree. So it's constant calibration, right? Because Singapore needs to continue to grow. It needs to be relevant. It needs to be able to attract talent. People's got to take Singapore seriously, and they got to see Singapore as a place of opportunity as well. Now, for that to happen, you have to be very open. And openness is not just about movement of people, movement of ideas as well, right? But at the same time, you also have now a settled citizenry, and not all of them are as mobile or as global. Then how do you ensure that this group, the interests of this group are looked after as well. So that constant balance, and I think at one stage, then Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong spoke about the cosmopolitans and the heartlanders. I think there's a very artificial divide, because I think in some ways, we are sometimes heartlanders and sometimes cosmopolitans. But I think he was trying to highlight a certain tension in terms of how much should Singapore remain open, but how much can it afford to remain closed? And this is where the tensions will always come.
Are there areas where you think that the Singapore government has to continually remain open despite political pressures to close?
That depends on the economic strategies of Singapore. I mean, what is it that Singapore wants to do? How is it going to develop? What are the new opportunities it wants to grow? And then it has to ask itself, do we have the homegrown talents to do this? And I believe that it is possible to always cultivate homegrown talents and give opportunities to Singaporeans to excel in this. But our population is shrinking and the Singapore base is also not large. So there will be occasions where you say we need to complement the Singapore homegrown talents together with people we can bring from the outside, talents from the outside. So here is where I think you have to have a strategy. What is it that you want to bring in? It cannot be unabated, open flow of people coming in just to take whatever they want to take. I think it has to be a very considered, deliberate policy of saying, what is it that we need? What sort of talents that we need to complement what we already have here, while giving the opportunities for Singaporeans also to always create more opportunities for Singapore to do well in different areas. And then where there's shortage, where there are gaps, then we try to fill them in with international talents. So this is where the calibration, that balance needs to happen.
So outside of logistics, trade, we think about finance, there's this idea of Singapore being an intellectual capital. And we are historically, and I think you pointed out in one of your books, that there has been a semblance of Singapore being the intellectual hub of Southeast Asia, be it through the introduction of the printing press into the region or establishing newspapers here. What would Singapore as an intellectual capital look like? And you're a dean of SUSS, the Singapore University of Social Sciences. So can you speak about maybe what will it take for Singapore to be an intellectual capital in this region? And then maybe the role that SUSS can play in that.
So Singapore has always got to be, in a way, ahead of the game, right? Because as a small country, we depend essentially on human resources. So innovation and all these, intellectual capital, as you call it, human capital, human development, these are all very central to us. So in a way, if you look at education, Singapore does very well in education. You look at the PISA scores and all this, Singapore does very well. We're also known to be quite creative, and our students can be very creative in their own ways as well. So higher ed, innovation, research and development, I think in these areas, Singapore does well, often punches above its weight. So I think these are areas that Singapore has to continue developing. But you can either develop based on existing paradigm and then be satisfied that you've reached an existing paradigm and said, we already excel, or you have to look ahead and say, what are the challenges ahead where Singapore needs to prepare for? Yeah. And this is where Singapore does well. I was told once that Singapore is always 10 years away from a disaster. And I said, what does that mean? So it means that if Singapore is not innovating all the time, staying ahead of the curve, in 10 years, if it stays still, it will come up to a point where it will be caught up by the rest of the world and then its value proposition is lost. So it always has to run forward and look forward. And this is where Singapore, I think, does well because it always anticipates what the issues are coming forward. So one of the issues now are, of course, an aging population, technology disrupting the workplace, people living longer, people working longer, and then finding that skills obsolescence is becoming more regular, quicker. Now, in that case, how do you prepare the workforce to be continuously relevant and are able to apply skills that are needed in a quickly changing kind of work environment? So here is where, looking forward, Singapore is now anticipating that continuing education, upskilling, reskilling is going to be an important part of the national strategy. In other words, it's not enough for people to say, I graduated at the age of 20, 22, 23, and I have enough skills and knowledge to last the next 50 years in whatever careers I choose. It's no longer acceptable, or it's no longer satisfactory that this can happen. So now what do? You basically prepare people or give people the opportunity to continuously upgrade. And that's where lifelong learning comes in. So a university like SUSS is actually being set up to take care of this. When students who did not go to university after A-levels or the IB gone to work and now find that they need the skills or the knowledge or the competencies to do more things because they've come to a kind of a stage where whatever they had in terms of their training is no longer sufficient for them to progress in work or pivot to another area of work. That is where a university like SUSS becomes important because the opportunity to come in, get a skill or get a new set of knowledge so that you can then move on to another set of job becomes increasingly important. And this cannot be just at one stage in life. It has to be continuous. So we see people coming back to university at the age of 30, 40, even 50. And if you are going to work until 70 or even beyond later on, you need that continuous upskilling and upgrading of your knowledge. So universities no longer can just function in a traditional way and say that as long as I teach my undergraduates and I graduate them, I'm done. So they have to continuously now feature as part of ongoing training and education. So a university like SUSS was set up for this purpose. And in this way, the government has foresight in establishing an institution like this.
Yeah, I think if I look at SUSS mandate or maybe function, it will be kind of to implement or institutionalize the art of reinvention, right? What we're trying to do is constantly get people to reinvent themselves. And in similar sense, when we think about Singapore's role in the region, is always to be kind of the pilot.
Yes.
We always play the role of the pilot. So if it works in Singapore, then we can say that in the other region, our value prop to our neighbors is that we have done the pilot in that sense. And then what you can do is you can scale it up because we don't have the scale, but we can afford to kind of take risks and see how we can innovate on the educational landscape.
Yeah. No, I want to add to that. And Singapore is small enough and the system integrated enough that you can do all of system approach, because I've seen examples of larger countries where they have been thinking about, how to deal with aging, how to deal with skill obsolescence, how to deal with continuous education, but they're not working in an integrated whole, you see. So one part of the country does this, another part does that, and sometimes there's no coordination. Singapore is small enough for us to sort of deal with it in an integrated way so that every part supports itself. So employers, institutes of higher learning, government. So Skills Future, for instance, it's about government giving resources, but then it works with institutes of higher education, then it works with employers, it works with industries to have a kind of coordinated way where these things can be tackled. So you're right, in a sense, if it can be modeled in Singapore, then this could be examples where other countries can take and scale. But Singapore, in a way, because of our size and our sort of integrated nature, can experiment with many of these things which are going to be very important in the coming decades.
I wanted to ask a sidebar question, which was that as you are innovating on this front, what are the barriers to adult learning? Because I think the opportunity cost of pursuing something like a degree at SUSS is quite high. Maybe if you're looking to make a career pivot, the learning curve is high as well. So, and especially as you grow older, the retention might not be as good, or we might face more challenges towards concentrated learning, maybe as opposed to our younger years. So maybe what are some of the barriers that you see that, we need to tackle as we continually innovate on this front?
Yeah. So let me give you a profile of a student, a typical student in SUSS, who pursues the degree on what we call a part-time basis. So typically, the student will be in his 30s or in her 30s as a young family and working at the same time. So the student is doing three things, raising family, working, and studying. So it's very challenging. So how do you support someone like this? And this is where, it's not just giving the person a place in the university. So we have to think about how to deliver an education in these kinds of very challenging circumstances where the student comes to study at night, leaving work, come to study, and then leaving campus at 10 o'clock to go back, perhaps do a bit more work, tend to family, and then the next day it starts all over again. So the challenges are many. One, you need employers who are understanding. You need employers to be able to support this sort of endeavors. 2, you need resources so that these students can be supported in any way possible. So for instance, if they need some time off and employers need to be compensated, all this, who does that and how can we support that? 3, we need to have a system of education, adult education, because you cannot assume that older people learn the way younger people do. So andragogy, the sort of, science and art of teaching to older people needs to be developed. So all these all have to happen at the same time. And then, of course, the system. How do you provide a system where you can accommodate someone who is not able to attend classes on a regular basis, use of technology, for instance. But you also don't want to just depend on online courses because then the learning experience is compromised in several ways. So these are all the things that we need to do to make sure that we can support an adult learner. And it's not easy. It's many things coming together. And, in the end, it's also about a resilience of the students. And I see that in abundance in many of the students I've encountered. But they need to be supported. So a university like SUSS, I think, has to be configured and designed differently from a very typical, what we call legacy universities, where your main students are either the undergraduates who can study full-time or your graduate students who have the resources to pursue PhDs and all this. I think we are looking at a big middle bulge, and these people need support. And that's why I'm kind of thinking that we can do a lot more at SUSS, and if we do it well, I think we can show the way how to, help this very important group of people get on with their lives.
There's also this idea of Singapore, as we innovate on, say, for example, education, then we have useful lessons that we can share with others along the way, our own learnings. And it's by taking those kind of calculated risks in anticipation of future problems that we need to solve. So then I would have to circle back to you on the idea of Singapore, which is that Singapore on its own, if we look at it in its isolation, we can't really make sense of it. But when we understand ourselves in the broader context of our long history and the world, then our role can be better understood. So then my question to you is, what would your idea of Singapore be?
So the first assumption is that Singapore cannot grow in size. Our physicality, our physical size will always be limited. The influence of Singapore can only be extended through its innovation, through its ideas, through its success, through its ability to do things differently and do it very well. So here is where, after 65, we try to climb the value chain from basic manufacturing to, higher end R&D, and then to, as you said, intellectual, pursuits, and to being very innovative and ahead of the curve in various things, from technology, innovation, manufacturing, R&D to research. So I think these are things that Singapore should continue to do well. Now, so here is where I think the phrase I used in my book is smallness unconstrained. How do you unconstrain a smallness? And that is through ideas and through doing things very well. And Singapore needs to continue doing that. So if you look at our long history, in moments where Singapore does not innovate or Singapore does not try to sort of stay ahead of the curve, it fades. Now, of course, you have to contextualize that not everything is just technology, but its ability to read the winds and the ability to sort of tack on to possibilities and opportunities, I think those are times when Singapore succeeds. So at different times of its history, I think it has to demonstrate its relevance and its ability to ride the waves. And I think this will happen again in Singapore's future when things will change, geopolitics, the world order will change. How Singapore responds to that will depend on its abilities again. The long history does not end in 65, it continues. And I think if you look at that in that perspective, then you'll find that it's a constant negotiation of circumstances outside our control. But if you know how to ride the waves well, I think you'll do well.
As we talk about Singapore being the exporter of ideas, because that's the only way we can unconstrain our smallness. What are some of the best ideas you think that Singapore has exported into the world so far?
I think it's not consciously told the world that these are things that were made or developed in Singapore that you should learn from. But I think through our example, I think being open to ideas, being prepared to innovate and be different and not to follow traditions or conventional wisdoms, being willing to take chances, being useful to the rest of the world, I think, or being useful to the region, and being a good player in international order, in multilateralism, in trade. I think those are examples that Singapore shows. And that by developing its people, by developing local talents, even for a country that has no natural resources, Singapore shows that this is a way you can succeed, you see. And I think that's a good example that there's a place in the world for small states if it's well organized, if its people are good, well trained, and also people who are prepared to innovate and do things differently and in a way take chances. And I think that's where Singapore should continue to develop and show that as an example to the rest of the world.
So the export is actually the meta idea, which is that as long as governments are willing to take creative risk or calculated risk, and consciously push for innovation, you can get good outcomes.
Yeah. So my concern is that complacency will set in, and especially amongst younger Singaporeans who have always grown up in stability, in very nice conditions, very nice environments, assuming that this is a normal state of affairs for Singapore and this will continue to be the state of affairs for Singapore, there will always be these disruptions and we must be prepared for it. So complacency is dangerous, and complacency and also a certain expectation that if things go wrong, the government will take care of things. Again, that sort of mentality may not serve Singapore well. In the end, it's about the people of Singapore. And I think if we can show that, that Singaporeans have that resilience, can take chances, can rise to the occasion when they need to, I think then Singapore has a good future.
And that's the utility of history, that it gives you a long-term perspective, that we see the 65 or 60 years of Singapore out of the 700 plus years. The hard thing I struggle with sometimes is that history is, at the end of the day, still an abstract concept. It's not something we can tangibly feel. It's not numbers that we can see, right? It's usually narratives we tell ourselves. What's the best way to approach history or an interest in history?
So I think for a lot of Singaporeans, history is seen as a school subject. So they study in school, and then the moment the year ends, they say that I returned everything to my teacher, I've forgotten about history. But history as part of life's lesson, I think, is so critical. So I always meet people in their 50s and 60s who tell me, actually, I've always loved history. And these are engineers, lawyers, doctors. As they grow older, they see the utility of history. They see the importance and the relevance of history. But sadly for young people, because, they studied history in school and they say history is just a school subject. The moment I'm done with it, I'm not interested because I suffered learning it. I couldn't memorize dates and events and names. I didn't enjoy it. But if you look at history as a kind of life stories of a community or society and see it like that, I think then it becomes very rich because it explains where you come from and perhaps can indicate how you will be moving forward. So if history is seen in those terms, I think it will be relevant, useful, and very interesting. But you have to get to a stage in life where you say, actually, I'm beginning to understand why history is important because it explains to me why we are like that as an individual, as a family, as a community, as a country. The thing that I'm seeing is that it happens to people who are older in age, and for young people, maybe they'll get to that stage where beyond the sort of day-to-day existence, they are beginning to see something more, something that explains, I guess, themselves and their place in society. And I think history has a big part to play in that.
So how should I, if I'm vaguely interested in it, how should I approach it? Is it through maybe reading, finding like the thickest books I can find, or is it like through osmosis, maybe watching movies and stuff like that?
I think a whole range. If you enjoy reading, there are no shortage of history books, and you don't have to pick the thickest book that's hardest to read. Start with biographies, and human stories, human interest stories are always very interesting. start and try to understand, that nothing is static and there's always a context to things happening. Why did this thing happen during that time, during that decade, or during those few years? And try to draw connections there. Of course, not all of us will have time nor the inclination to read thick books, but history comes to us in so many other places. Museums, media, popular culture, movies. So there are many, many ways, but get yourself interested first, so I always say, and try to see, it's not just a kind of a pastime or an academic pursuit, but if history is all around us, and if we start looking, you'll find that it actually informs us so much. Not all the good things, but in a sense, it makes sense. I think if history helps you make sense of your life and those around you, I think it would have an important part to play.
Yeah. Last question I have. What advice would you give to someone who is just starting out their time as a professional?
I will say that when you go out to work, you must be prepared to have a very open mind. What do I mean by that? I've spoken to a lot of young people, and when they are looking for their first job, they're always looking for that perfect job, where they think that, it will make them very happy, fulfilled, and gratified. And maybe such a thing doesn't exist. When I say go with an open mind, what I'm saying is that when you go out and work, you must be able to accept both elation and despondency, because the real world is like that. You won't feel that you've landed this perfect job that will make you happy all the time. So you must be prepared to take the ups and the downs, and then learn from it, and then be prepared to say, okay, how do I respond to all these things, and not accept that there's nothing wrong with me and there's everything wrong with the organization I'm working for, and therefore I'm not going to change. It's just that the place is not ready for me. So I think if you are able to take that humility and say that actually I'm out there to learn, the world is very, the working world is not like school, and there will be ups and downs. But if I can take those, then you grow as a person. And when you grow as a person, I think you will continue to do well, no matter what the circumstances are. And people of your age will not have one job for many, many years, and then you will continue to grow and you will continue to take new challenges. But if you take that realistic approach, then I think you can sort of roll with it, so to speak, learn, pick up the right lessons, and I think then grow as you sort of work longer. But if you go in with the attitude that, I want to look for the perfect job, and I want a job to make me happy continuously, then you'll be in for disappointment. So I say, go with an open mind, be realistic, but be prepared to grow and be prepared to take the good as well as the bad. Yeah.
With that, thank you, Professor Tan, for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks, Keith.
If you enjoyed this episode, click on the video that's appearing on the screen right now.